People think betrayal is a sudden act, but it's not. It's a slow, quiet thing, creeping into your life until you're too deep to pull yourself out. For me, it started in a classroom, a place I thought was safe. My name is Sarah Miller, and I was a university lecturer, happily married, or so I thought. But what happened over a few short months changed everything. It's a story I wish I didn't have to tell, but it's one I can't keep inside any longer. It started so innocently. Liam was a student in one of my literature courses, and he stood out right away. He was sharp, curious, and had a way of looking at the world that reminded me why I fell in love with teaching. He wasn't just another student, he had a spark. At first, I saw him the way I saw all my students, just someone to mentor. But looking back, I can see where the cracks started to form. One day after class he lingered. He wanted to talk about an assignment, a poem analysis that he wasn't sure about. We spent 10 minutes going over it, but somehow, the conversation drifted. He asked me what drew me to teaching. I laughed, surprised at the question, and told him how I'd always loved stories, and how teaching felt like a way to share that love. He listened intently, his eyes locked on mine. It had been years since someone looked at me like that. I told myself it was nothing, just a student showing interest. But as the weeks went on, I noticed how often he stayed after class. He'd ask questions, share his thoughts about the readings, even make me laugh with little jokes. I found myself smiling when I saw him walk into the lecture hall, something I hadn't done in a long time. Then came the department's end-of-semester party. My husband, Tom, didn't want to go. He never liked these events, so I went alone. Liam was there, talking with other students and faculty, but when he saw me, he made a beeline for my table. We spent most of the evening talking. He told me about his dreams of becoming a writer, how he felt like he didn't quite fit in with the other students. I told him about my struggles when I was younger, how literature had been my escape. By the end of the night, I felt like I'd known him for years. When the party ended, he walked me to my car. It was dark and the air was cold. As we stood there, I felt a strange tension, something I hadn't felt in years. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. But he didn't. He just smiled and said goodnight. I drove home that night thinking about him. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought. But it wasn't. That moment stayed with me. The real turning point came a few weeks later. Liam asked if I could help him with his thesis after hours. I agreed, thinking it was just part of my job. We stayed late in my office, going over his draft. He was frustrated, second-guessing every word, and I tried to reassure him. At one point, he stopped and said, "You make me believe I can do this." It was such a simple thing to say, but it caught me off guard. No one had said anything like that to me in years, not even Tom. I didn't plan for what happened next. I don't even know how it started. One moment, we were talking about his work, and the next, the space between us disappeared. It was a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. After that night, I was consumed by guilt. I told myself it was a one-time lapse, but it wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how he made me feel. At home, I was distant, distracted. Tom noticed, but I couldn't tell him the truth. Every time Liam and I met after that, it felt like I was digging a deeper hole. I wanted to stop, but I didn't know how. They say guilt eats away at you, and they're right. After that night with Liam, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. Every time I walked into my classroom, I felt like everyone knew. But at the same time, I couldn't stop. It was as though I was addicted to the way he made me feel. Alive, valued, seen. At home, things with Tom got worse. He was trying to connect with me, asking if I wanted to go on dates or take a weekend trip together. I should have said yes. I should have grabbed that chance to fix things. But instead, I pulled away even more. I'd make excuses, work, exhaustion, anything to avoid being alone with him. And then there was Liam. He made everything seem easy, like the rest of the world didn't exist when we were together. We started meeting outside of my office. It was risky, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop myself. We'd grab coffee at a small cafe off campus, sit in the back where no one could see us. We'd talk about everything: his plans after graduation, my frustrations with work, my regrets about life. I think that's what drew me to him the most. With Liam, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to be the perfect lecturer, the perfect wife. I could just be me. But every time I went home, the guilt came rushing back. Tom would ask how my day was, and I'd mumble something vague, then retreat to our bedroom. I hated lying to him, but the thought of confessing what I'd done was unbearable. The more time I spent with Liam, the harder it became to focus on anything else. My lectures felt hollow, like I was just going through the motions. I started avoiding my colleagues, worried they'd notice something was off. And then one day, Liam suggested we go out of town. Just for a day, he said. No one will know. I should have said no. I should have ended things right there. But instead I agreed. We drove to a small town about an hour away, had lunch at a little diner, and walked along a quiet trail. It was beautiful, peaceful. For a few hours, I let myself believe that we were just two people enjoying each other's company, without all the complications. But the moment we got back, reality hit me like a freight train. Tom called while I was driving home, asking if I'd be back for dinner. I lied again, telling him I had a late meeting. My stomach churned as I said the words, but I couldn't stop myself. Lying had become too easy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the look on Tom's face when I walked in. How tired and defeated he seemed. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his disappointment. I started to wonder if he knew. I mean, how could he not? I was coming home late, avoiding his questions, pulling away from him completely. He must have felt it. But if he did, he never said a word. Things with Liam weren't as perfect as they seemed, either. At first, he was sweet, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. But as the weeks went on, I started to see another side of him. He was jealous, possessive even. If I didn't reply to his texts right away, he'd get upset. If I had to cancel one of our meetings, he'd sulk for days. I realized then that what we had wasn't sustainable. It wasn't real. But by that point, I felt trapped. I didn't know how to end it without destroying everything. One night, Tom finally confronted me. He didn't accuse me of anything. He just asked, "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I wanted to say yes, to reassure him that everything was fine. But I couldn't. I didn't answer him, and the silence between us was deafening. He didn't push, didn't demand an explanation. He just nodded, like he already knew the answer, and went to bed. That moment should have been my wake-up call. It should have been the moment I stopped everything and fought for my marriage. But instead, I let things spiral even further. I was in too deep, and I didn't know how to climb out. There's a point where you know you've gone too far, where the weight of your choices feels unbearable. For me, that moment came 3 months after things began with Liam. By then, the secrecy, the lies, and the guilt had become part of my daily life. I was barely holding it together, and I knew something had to give. It was a Friday afternoon when Liam showed up at my office unannounced. He was upset, angry even. I had canceled our last meeting, telling him I was busy with work, but the truth was I needed space. His intensity was becoming overwhelming, and I didn't know how to handle it. He closed the door behind him and asked me point blank if I was pulling away. I could see the frustration in his eyes, and for a moment, I felt cornered. I tried to calm him down, telling him everything was fine, but he wasn't convinced. "I don't want to lose you," he said. His words hit me hard, but instead of comforting me, they made me realize how far I had let things go. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two lives, two people, two versions of myself. That weekend, I decided I needed to figure out what I really wanted. Tom suggested we go out for dinner, a rare attempt to reconnect, and I agreed, hoping it might help. At the restaurant, I watched him talk about his day, his plans for the weekend, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. He was trying, and I wasn't giving him anything in return. When he asked me how work was going, I almost broke down. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess and beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. The next day, Liam texted me, asking if we could meet. I hesitated before replying, but eventually I agreed. We met at the cafe we always went to, but this time something felt different. He was quieter than usual, almost nervous. After a few minutes of small talk, he said, "I think I'm falling for you." I froze. Those words should have made me happy, but instead they terrified me. This wasn't what I had wanted. I wasn't looking for love or a new relationship. I was just trying to escape my own unhappiness. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. The silence between us was heavy, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. When I finally managed to speak, all I could say was, "We need to talk." I told him we needed to end things, that what we were doing was wrong, and it couldn't continue. He didn't take it well. He asked me if I regretted everything, and I didn't know how to answer. Did I regret it? Yes, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore how much he had meant to me during those months. He had given me something I hadn't felt in years: attention, excitement, passion. But it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Liam left without saying much, and I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I felt relief, but also an overwhelming sense of loss. That night, Tom asked me again if I was okay. He said I seemed distracted, that I wasn't myself. I wanted to tell him everything, to finally get it all out, but I was too scared. Instead, I told him I was just tired, that work had been stressful. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than ever. Ending things with Liam should have been the start of fixing my life, but instead it left me feeling empty. I couldn't focus on anything, not my lectures, not my marriage, not even myself. Liam stopped coming to class for a while, and when he finally returned, he barely looked at me. The distance between us was painful, but I knew it was for the best. At home, things with Tom didn't improve. He tried, but I couldn't bring myself to meet him halfway. I felt like I had destroyed everything. My marriage, my career, my sense of self. I wanted to undo it all, to go back to the person I was before. But I knew that wasn't possible. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. I thought ending things with Liam would bring relief, that it would free me to focus on repairing my marriage and moving forward. But I underestimated how much damage had already been done. My choices didn't just affect me, they rippled through everything and everyone around me. The weeks after breaking things off with Liam were some of the hardest of my life. He stopped coming to my office, stopped lingering after class, and though I knew it was for the best, I couldn't help but feel the loss. At the same time, my relationship with Tom was unraveling faster than ever. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. And I didn't have the courage to tell him. I tried to throw myself into my work, hoping it would distract me, but nothing seemed to help. My lectures felt lifeless. My students seemed distant, and even the books I once loved brought me no comfort. Liam, meanwhile, started showing up to class again, but he was different. He barely participated, kept his head down, and avoided me at all costs. It hurt more than I expected, seeing him like that, knowing I was the reason. One afternoon, he came to my office for the first time in weeks. I wasn't expecting him, and when I saw him standing in the doorway, my heart sank. He looked tired, angry even. "I need to talk," he said. His voice was firm, but I could hear the hurt behind it. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. He didn't. "What was all of this to you?" he asked. Did I mean anything, or was I just a distraction? His words hit me harder than I expected. I tried to explain, to tell him that I had cared about him, that it wasn't as simple as he was making it seem. But he cut me off. "You ended it like it was nothing," he said. "Like I didn't matter." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't deny how much he had meant to me, but I also couldn't let things continue. He deserved better than what I could give him, and I told him that. He left without another word, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair where he'd been. At home, things with Tom were falling apart faster than I could keep up. He started working late, staying out longer, and I knew it was his way of avoiding me. I wanted to fix things, but every time I tried to talk to him, the words wouldn't come. One evening, he finally confronted me. "Sarah," he said, "I need to know what's going on. You've been distant for months. Are you? Is there someone else?" My heart stopped. I could see the pain in his eyes, the fear of hearing the answer he didn't want. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him everything was fine, but the lie felt too heavy. Instead, I said, "I've made mistakes." It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough. He nodded, his face a mix of anger and heartbreak, and walked out of the room. That night, I realized just how much I had destroyed. My marriage, my career, my sense of self. It was all crumbling around me, and I had no one to blame but myself. I wanted to fix things, to undo the damage I had caused, but I didn't know where to start. A colleague suggested I talk to someone, and though I was hesitant at first, I knew I needed help. The therapist listened without judgment, letting me unravel everything I had been holding inside. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. It didn't erase what I had done, but it gave me a starting point, a way to begin piecing my life back together. It wasn't easy. Tom and I had long, painful talks about what had happened, about the distance between us, the choices I had made, and whether our marriage could survive. I didn't know if we'd make it, but I knew I had to try. As for Liam, I saw him less and less as the semester came to an end. We never spoke about what had happened between us again, and I think that was for the best. Looking back, I can see how everything spiraled out of control, how one choice led to another until I was too far gone. I'll carry the weight of those choices with me for the rest of my life. But I've also learned that it's never too late to try to make things right. It won't erase the past, but it's a start. Regret has a way of settling into your life, like an unwelcome guest that never leaves. By the time Liam graduated, the weight of everything I'd done felt unbearable. I wanted to move on, to rebuild, but the damage had been done. Still, I knew I had to try. After my first few therapy sessions, I started to see things more clearly. For months, I had blamed my unhappiness on everything around me, my marriage, my work, even Tom. But the truth was, the unhappiness had been inside me all along. My choices weren't about Liam or Tom. They were about me running from the emptiness I felt. Understanding that didn't make things easier, but it gave me a place to start. Tom and I decided to see a couples therapist. It was his idea, and I wasn't sure it would work. But for the first time, we were forced to really talk, to confront all the things we had been avoiding for years. In one session, Tom admitted he had felt neglected for a long time. "You stopped seeing me, Sarah," he said. "I didn't know how to reach you." His words cut deep, but he was right. I had stopped seeing him, stopped trying. And in doing so, I had pushed him away. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were going in circles. But little by little, we started to reconnect. We talked about the early days of our marriage, the things that had brought us together, and the dreams we had once shared. I told him about my struggles, my feelings of inadequacy, and how lost I had felt. He listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same team again. Work was harder to navigate. Every time I stepped into the lecture hall, I felt a pang of shame. I worried about what my colleagues might think, whether anyone suspected what had happened. Liam and I had kept our relationship hidden, but I couldn't shake the fear that someone would find out. I threw myself into my teaching, determined to prove, to myself, if no one else, that I could still be good at my job. As for Liam, I didn't see much of him after graduation. He sent me a short email thanking me for my guidance, and I replied with a polite but distant note wishing him the best. It was strange, knowing someone who had been such a big part of my life was now just gone, but it was better that way. In therapy, I learned a lot about myself, about why I had made the choices I did, and how to start forgiving myself. It wasn't about excusing what I had done, but about understanding it. My therapist said something that stuck with me. Guilt can be a tool for change, but only if you let it be. I realized I had been using my guilt as a shield, keeping myself stuck in the past instead of working toward a better future. Tom and I started finding joy in the little things again. Cooking dinner together, going for walks, even just sitting on the porch and talking. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the past felt like a weight we couldn't escape. But we were trying, and that meant everything. In the classroom, I found a new sense of purpose. I stopped seeing my students as a reflection of my own failures or desires, and started focusing on their potential. It reminded me of why I had chosen this career in the first place. I also set boundaries, clear, firm boundaries that I hadn't enforced before. I knew I could never let myself slip again. Looking back, I know I can't change what happened. I can't undo the hurt I caused to Tom, to Liam, or even to myself. but I can learn from it. Life isn't about being perfect, it's about trying to be better. And though I'll carry the weight of my mistakes with me, I'm learning how to let them guide me, not define me. The thing about regret is that it never truly leaves you. It lingers like a shadow, reminding you of the choices you made and the people you hurt. But it also pushes you to grow, to be better, to face yourself honestly. By the time a full year had passed, I had learned to live with my mistakes, not by forgetting them, but by making peace with them. My marriage to Tom wasn't magically fixed, but it was stronger. We had learned to talk, to listen, to meet each other where we were. It was messy and imperfect, but it was real. For the first time in years, I felt like we were truly partners again. One evening, we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I turned to him and said, "Thank you for staying." He looked at me and simply said, "Thank you for trying." Those words meant more to me than I could express. At work, I started focusing on mentorship in a healthier way. I created clearer boundaries with my students, ensuring that professional respect was the foundation of every interaction. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about being the teacher they deserved. I also began mentoring younger faculty members, sharing what I'd learned about the complexities of balancing personal and professional lives. I found that helping others navigate their struggles brought me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Therapy became a cornerstone of my life. It helped me unpack not just the affair, but the deeper issues that had led me there. The insecurities, the loneliness, the fear of failure. One session, my therapist asked me, "What do you want your life to look like moving forward?" That question stayed with me. For so long, I had been focused on what I didn't want, regret, guilt, shame. But I hadn't thought about what I did want. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. At first, it was just journal entries, fragments of thoughts and feelings, but eventually it turned into essays and stories. Writing became a way for me to process everything, to make sense of the chaos in my mind. One of those essays turned into a book, a reflection on mistakes, growth, and the human experience. It wasn't about my affair specifically, but about the broader lessons I had learned. Publishing it was terrifying. I worried about judgment, about what people would think. But the response was overwhelmingly positive. People reached out, sharing their own stories of regret and redemption. It reminded me that we're all flawed, that we all have things we wish we could take back. Tom and I started rebuilding our social life, reconnecting with old friends, and making new ones. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of unspoken pain, but we were in it together. One evening, as we cleaned up after a dinner party, Tom turned to me and said, "I'm proud of you." Those words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had felt like I didn't deserve his forgiveness, his support. Hearing him say that made me realize how far we had come. A year later, I was invited to speak at a conference about the challenges of balancing personal and professional lives. Standing there, looking out at the audience, I felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. I told them what I had learned, that mistakes don't define you, but how you respond to them does. That facing your failures head-on is the only way to truly grow. And that forgiveness, whether from others or yourself, is a process, not a destination. I'll never forget what happened with Liam, or the pain it caused. But I've learned to accept it as part of my story, a chapter that taught me who I am and who I want to be. Life isn't about erasing the past. It's about moving forward, carrying the lessons with you. And while I'll always carry the weight of my choices, I know now that I'm strong enough to bear it.